Okay, welcome everybody. This is our 11th episode of the Western Biology Evolution Seminar Series, or WBESS for short. And today I really have the honor to have here with me Sam Scheiner. He is very, very famous for having been studying the evolution of phenotypic plasticity in different systems. And I will let him speak about this and other things as well today. And yeah, I think we can get started. So I'll turn my camera off, Sam, and then the floor is yours. Thank you for being here with us today.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me. I hope people find this interesting. So I'm not going to talk about phenotypic plasticity today, although that is one of the things I work on. We're actually going to sort of move up a couple of levels and talk much more generally about the role of theory in biology, what theories are, and so forth. And I hope you find this interesting. So in terms of how the talk is structured, I'm going to just start out by a little bit about the motivation, where all this came from, and then a bit because often as scientists, I mean, we work with theories all the time, but we don't often think about what theory is as theory. And then we'll delve into the theory of biology and its general principles, and then a little bit about what other sort of general theories there are in biology. So what sparked sort of this initial approach was a workshop on theory and biology, December of 2006. It was part of a national academy, which were resulted in a National Academy report, The Role of Theory in Advancing Biology. Um, it's I mentioned this report, don't bother to read it. It's actually pretty bad, but it was that which sparked my own interest in saying, well, I can do this better. And in particular, the person who was representing ecology, who stood up and said, ecology has no theories. And I said, that's just wrong. But it does say in this report that biologists use theory, but don't really recognize its role. Um, in paying, especially in terms of making things explicit. And that's really been sort of the heart of this whole process that I've been going through now for about the last 15 years or so, which is to help us be much more explicit and conscious of what we're doing with theory and biology. Um, you know, there are parts of biology, such as ecology, which have a rich history of theories. So here's a little timeline with some of the key theories in ecology going all the way back into the 19th century. But you can see there was especially a big increase um, sort of in the middle of the last century. Uh, and I did a little survey of how many papers in three leading ecology and evolution journals, the Journal of Ecology, Evolution, and then American Naturalist, what percentage of the papers stated in their introduction that they were either developing or testing some sort of a theory. And what I found really interesting is, first of all, you can see there actually wasn't a whole lot until around 1960, and then things really increased. I looked at one journal per decade here, one issue a decade, but in particular, the journal Ecology at most 50% of the papers sort of cited any sort of theory in their papers, which was a little disappointing. And so this all led to an effort by Mike Willig, my colleague at University of Connecticut, and myself to present a general theory of ecology. Yes, ecology actually not only has theories, but it also has a general theory. And that then led further to a paper that I did that came out in 2010 that looked at theory not only in ecology, but across all of biology. In addition, this book came out delving into that theory for ecology. So I started with ecology, but then moved out from there. And I'll talk a little bit more then about where the rest of that went sort of towards the end of the talk. So, but what is a theory, right? We're scientists, we deal with theories all the time. What actually is it? So there are a variety of definitions, but one of which is a theory is a coherent group of general propositions that are used as principles of explanation for a class of phenomena, right? So what a theory does is it organizes our information, our knowledge as a way of explaining natural phenomena, right? That's what science in general is doing. It's explaining the natural world. Now, this view of theory is what's called the pragmatic view, if you talk to philosophers of science. If you're interested, this is an online encyclopedia. You can read this article. But notice that this is all verbal, right? So this view, theories are really a set of verbal statements, and a good instance of this is Darwin's The Origin of Species, right? There's not a single equation in The Origin. It's all just a verbal presentation of his theory. So what do we use theories for? Well, we actually use them in a variety of ways. First of all, it organizes our ideas. So having a sense of not only what you're working on, but how what you're working on exists within a larger theoretical framework helps organize those ideas, see how they're connected elsewhere. It helps with model construction and hypothesis testing, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But it also tells us what our most important questions are, right? What are the core questions that reach across, for example, all of ecology or all of biology? It helps us with prioritizing research, and I'll give you some examples at the end about that. So, okay, so what is theory? We usually think of theory as one kind of thing, but what I would propose is there's actually different kinds of theories that operate in different manners. I've presented this as sort of this hierarchy, which for the purposes of being able to sort of orient yourself in this hierarchical space, I've labeled these as general theories, constitutive theories, and models. All of these are kinds of theories. And I'll also point out that it's not just a simple 3 different layers. You can have a variety of things that are nested within. So one general theory can be nested in a larger general theory, and these theory domains can overlap. And again, I'll show you how that works as we go. But we're going to start, and so these 3 layers, they form 3 different kinds of roles. So at the level of models, that's where hypotheses are generated, predictions are made, and then we test them. That's where the theoretical rubber hits the empirical road at that model level. Constitutive theories, what they are model blueprints. They're ways of telling us how we build those models. And then the general theories that they exist within, those are the background assumptions that we need to be aware of explicitly, because often those background assumptions are simply implicit, and by making them explicit, that will prevent you from going astray when you're constraining yourself by saying, yes, we know that X is true, but for this model, we're going to assume that it's not true. And again, I'll give you examples of that. So we have this hierarchy of general theories, constitutive theories, and models, and I'm going to work through this from the bottom up. So what do we mean by a model? Well, there's lots of different kinds of models in biology. So, for example, the structure of DNA. We talk about model organisms, Drosophila, mice, but also equations. That's often when people say model, that's the first thing they think about is an equation, but also like this skeleton, this reconstruction of a dinosaur, or a phylogeny is a model, a hypothesis. So these are all models. Most of the time, though, we deal with these mathematical models. So, but we use them in various ways. So, for example, a model organism, right? So here are two different strains of rats, this obese one and a regular, or mice, sorry, regular and not. And those might be used in research as a way of asking questions about obesity in humans. Now, why is it that we can study mice, obese mice, and have them tell us something about humans? Well, theory tells us that we can make this inference and it comes from the theory of evolution, right? So mice and humans share a common ancestor. Because they share a common ancestor, the organisms then have shared related features, and therefore, we can use mice as a human model, right? We can use those shared features. They're both mammals, and so we can use one as a model for the other. And so, but that inference, it's the theory that tells us that that inference is correct. Again, mostly that's just implicit, but it helps to make it explicit. So like if you're using fish as your model instead of mice, well, fish are more distantly related to humans than mice are, because mice and humans are both mammals. And again, that might then constrain the kinds of inferences you're going to make. So theory makes explicit those background assumptions. So what are constitutive theories? I said they are the blueprints for building models, and I'm going to give you an example which hopefully you're all familiar with, and so showing you how then constitutive theories link with models. And what we're going to do is we're going to use Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, because it's a great instance and one that we're all familiar with. So there's various ways of describing his theory in a verbal way. This is a common one. So if individuals within a population vary in their characteristics, and if that phenotypic variation leads to differences in fitness, and if that phenotypic variation has a genetic basis, then the population will change its characteristics over generations, right? So that's the part of Darwin's theory. And so we can summarize it, these three different kinds of variation: phenotypic, fitness, and genetic, leading to evolution. And from that verbal theory, Fisher and others came up with this equation. This is what's often called the Breeder's equation. This is a slightly different version. You may have seen it as where delta Z is change, and the genetic variance over the phenotypic variance is often shown as heritability, h squared. But I like this formulation because each of these terms then links to one of those propositions. So phenotypic variation is shown here. Fitness variation, that's selection. There's the S term here. Then VG is the genetic variation. And then evolution is that change in mean phenotype. So this is an example, right? So Darwin presented this constitutive theory, as I would term it, as a verbal framework, and then you take that verbal framework and you turn it into a mathematical model. that you can then use to make predictions. If I do this kind of selection on this organism, this kind of change will happen. Now, there's a different kind of formulation of natural selection. This goes back to Haldane, a contemporary of Fisher, where in this case, the other formulation is for trait values, like for height of an organism or body mass, something like that, some kind of quantitative trait. This is, in this case, P is the frequency of a particular allele at a given locus. And this equation, so delta P is the equivalent to that delta Z bar. It's the change in gene frequency over time, over one generation, given this sort of formulation. Now, we have two different models, both of which are mathematically related to that verbal theory by Darwin, uh, and uh, but so both of them derive from the same constitutive theory, which tells us that those two different formulations, even though they look completely different, have to be somehow related. And in fact, it was Fisher who, there was that huge debate the beginning of the 20th century between what was called the biometricians and the Mendelists about quantitative versus allelic views of evolution. And then what Fisher was able to do was show that if you use certain assumptions, for example, about additivity and many genes of small effect, that these two views actually can be reconciled. But one of the things that tell us, oh, we know we can reconcile these models in some fashion is they both come from the same constitutive theory. So they have to be related to each other in some form or another. So what the point is then that theory then guides the development of models and allows you to actually unify models in some way. So both guides development and model unification. So that's models and constitutive theories and what they are. So I hope at this point you have some sense of what these two levels in this hierarchy are. But now we're going to talk about general theories. So what do I mean by a general theory? So a general theory consists of a scientific domain. You've carved out some kind of domain of phenomena that you're trying to explain, plus a set of general principles that set the background for then the constitutive theories, right? So as I said earlier, the general theory are the background assumptions. And those are stated as general principles, which can be either confirmed generalizations, that is, condensations of large bodies of facts, or other kinds of labeled regularities. So here they are for a theory of biology. So now what I'm going to give you is the background, the 10 background principles, assumptions behind which we can fit all of our biological knowledge. So the first principle is that life consists of open, non-equilibrial systems that are persistent, right? From as individuals, we persist from moment to moment, and also life over geological eons persists on Earth. So the persistence can either be, over short time periods but over long time periods. But that is sort of what defines life. So that's the sort of central principle of biology, is understanding that. Number two, the cell is the fundamental unit of life. So you have to have some kind of packaging, something that allows all the parts to interact with each other, so they don't just diffuse out ad infinitum into the environment. Principle number 3, life requires a system to store, use, and transmit information. And which we usually think of as genes, but it can be much more complex than that. But you need that information system for to be a living system. So we've defined our living systems, and then what are other things about those living systems? First of all, that they vary in their composition and structure at all levels. So they vary, from individual to individual. Here's a bunch of different kinds of cats, but also we've got this sort of hierarchical structure that we think about, going from molecules to cells up to ecosystems and the biosphere. And there's variation sort of hierarchically and also then sort of across different communities, ecosystems, among different individuals and so forth. So there's living systems vary, and they vary way more than, let's say geological systems or so forth. But then living systems consist of complex sets of interacting parts. Certainly, humans, mammals have all kinds of different systems, skeletal systems, circulatory, different kinds of systems. But even the most simple single-celled bacterium or archaea, even within there are, let's say DNA molecules, there are ribosomes, there are proteins, they might have substructures within them. So it doesn't really matter if you're talking about individual cells or whole organisms or ecosystems. You've got these complex systems of interacting parts. That's important because then that complexity leads to what are called emergent properties. So what is an emergent property? And I'll use a non-living example because I think it makes this clear. So let's say you have all of the parts of an automobile laid out on the floor in front of you like you have here. So there's all the parts of that automobile. They're not going anywhere. It's only once all of those parts have been assembled all in the right way and well, you may not need a driver, right? It could be an autonomous vehicle. That vehicle on the right here, that vehicle has the property of motion, right? It will move. It will go places, assuming it has fuel and so forth. That motion is an emergent property, right? So that's not a property that exists in any individual part. It only exists because those parts are put together in the right sort of complex form. And of course, the same is true for us, right? So I'm moving. The only reason I can move is because I have a complex system, metabolic system, physiological system that allows me to do that. So it's complexity which creates emergent properties. Life itself is an emergent property of chemistry. Next, that complexity creates a role for contingency, right? For random processes to play a role. Living systems are not ever only deterministic. There's always some randomness somewhere in the system. And again, it can exist at a variety of different levels, and it comes from that complexity. So number 8, so we said living systems persist. Persistence of living systems require that they're capable of change over time. And again, that exists from the level of an individual, right? So you as an individual persist from moment to moment because inside of you, you've got a metabolism, which is churning away. So that's change over time. Your metabolism stops, you drop dead. And over geological eons, living systems persist because of evolution, right? That evolutionary change allows biospheres to adjust to changes in climate, for example, over time. So almost there. I said there are 10. Here's number 9. So living systems come from other living systems, right? So all life on Earth is related to each other. There, at some point, there was a what's called the last common universal ancestor of everything. And then finally, life originated from non-life, right? So at some point, the universe happened, the Big Bang happened, the planets formed. We had non-living, but maybe organic molecules, which came together in the first living systems in some sort of cell. And there's a lot of research going on right now about exactly how that happened. But that's the last little principle. So here they are. Here are the 10 general principles for the theory of biology. I'm not going to read through all of these, but instead, here's a way of just remembering what those are. So living systems have the properties of persistence, boundedness, and information. And so those first 3 principles really define what is life. And if we're going to look for example, life elsewhere in the solar system, elsewhere in our galaxy, what we would say is any living system would have these properties. Or if we, at some point actually create artificial life, maybe made out of silicon and on this planet, it would have to have these properties. Then the next 4 principles, variation, complexity, emergence, and contingency, those are all about life's complexities and how it comes about and the implications for that complexity. And then the final 3, change, continuity, and origins, is about life's dynamics. So there are the 10 principles. And so that's the general theory of biology in a nutshell. And then, so those are background assumptions. So for example, this assumption about variation, right? Systems always vary. If you look at a lot of ecological models, often you treat a species, let's say in a population dynamic model, a lot of population dynamic models assume that all individuals are identical in their demographic properties. Now, we know that's not true. That doesn't mean that the model's not useful. In fact, it can be. On the other hand, we know that if we relax that assumption and put in demographic variation among individuals, we can get, depending upon circumstances, a different population dynamic. Or if you add stochasticity, right? So the chance that can happen, if you add stochasticity into the model, again, you can get a different dynamic. So it just means that you have to keep in mind, if you're building a model that doesn't have stochasticity in it or doesn't have variation in it, it's not that it's wrong. It could be useful for what you're trying to model in this instance, but those are assumptions that you have made. And if you keep this theory in mind, you'll always know, well, I've made that assumption. Maybe I need to relax it, check to make sure that it may or may not be important for the particular modeling that I'm doing. Biology, in the schema that I've come up with, there are 5 then other general theories that fit within that theory of biology, and they are theories of evolution, ecology, organisms, cells, and genetics. And I present them in this form where all of them overlap with each other in one fashion or another. So, general theories, it's not a strict hierarchy. They do have overlapping domains. And what's kind of interesting is then there are linkages among those general theories. So the theory of natural selection is, I think there is a reason why the theory of evolution by natural selection is considered so central to all of biology, because it turns out that these four parts to them all link to those five general theories, right? So phenotypic variation is all about the things that happen within cells and organisms. So they're related to those general theories of cells and organisms. Fitness variation is a statement about the ecology of an organism. Genetic variation, of course, then links to the theory of genetics. And then, of course, we then have evolution. So the theory of evolution by natural selection is actually at that intersection point of all the other general theories. That's not true of other kinds of constitutive theories. They can exist within just one of those domains. But this one is interesting for the fact that it really is a link between all of them. In terms of the scope of the theories, we think of this hierarchy from molecules up to the biosphere. So the theory of cells really spans between molecules and cells. Genetics spans between molecules up to individuals. Then organisms are really, the theory of organisms is really about cells and how they exist within whole organisms. Evolution is, we think of as populations and individuals within populations. And then, of course, ecology covers from the biosphere down to individuals. And if you look at this, the real intersection point is individuals. So sort of the heart of biology is understanding individuals and then how they fit within that whole hierarchy. So what those the six general theories, so the theory of biology and then the five other general theories, they actually define what I would say are biology's core questions. So the theory of biology, the central question that all of biology is ultimately about is, why does life manage to persist from instance to instance or over geological ages? That ultimately is the question we ask as biologists. The theory of cells is really about how does a cell maintain its structure and function. The theory of organisms is how does an individual maintain its integrity, right? So how are we maintained from moment to moment as individual organisms? Genetics is, the central question of genetics is, why do offspring resemble their parents? Ultimately, all the questions in genetics can be crystallized into that one. Evolution is, what is the cause of organismal change and diversity over time? And then ecology is what explains the distribution of organisms on the earth. So individuals within populations, within species, diversity at the community level and so forth of species and so forth. So there it is. There's biology's six core questions that form the heart of those six general theories. So I mentioned that we can use this structure for assessing research. So what do I mean by that? So, what is a bold research program? Well, bolder research addresses a broader domain or a more general theory, right? So we have this hierarchy, right? So a model is about a particular domain. So that the Breeder's equation is about how quantitative traits change over relatively short periods of time. It breaks down generations, but tens of generations. So that's a domain. On the other hand, if we're talking about the theory of evolution, we're looking at the general principles of that theory. That's addressing, all factors of life. it tells us not only how bold our research is, but how risky it is. So the least risky is something which solidifies and established principles, right? We said that these general principles are these condensations of lots of facts, and depending upon domain and how well it's defined, those facts may or may not be well established. Once they're a well established principle, we can add additional information to them that solidifies them, but that's pretty that's not risky science. On the other hand, if you've got an unconfirmed principle at some level and you're trying to establish it, that's obviously riskier because the principle may be wrong. Or if you want to put forth a brand new principle at some level in the hierarchy, remember I said those principles can the domains can be narrower or broader. They could be, for example, about all mammals, or maybe they're about mammals in Africa, or they could be about all vertebrate life, right? So that's different size domains. And you want to put forth a new principle, obviously that's risky because you don't have much information there. And then finally, the riskiest work is you're attempting to disconfirm an established principle. But that can sometimes be the most exciting science, right? So if we think about in evolutionary biology, the modern synthesis happens in the first half of the 20th century. And it's very much sort of a deterministic view of how evolution happens. And then Masatoshi Nei comes along in the 1960s, right after the modern synthesis sort of ends, and says, oh no, drift can be really important. And he puts forth this theory, especially about drift at the molecular level, which then set off decades of new research to discover, well, what is the relative importance of drift, especially at the molecular level. For example, third position codons, the are those actually subject to selection or not? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But that was sort of a new principle in evolution having to do with the importance of drift. And those they're the riskiest, but they're also the most exciting. So all of this work, I have to acknowledge several people. So a lot of this was inspired by Jim Collins, who was the assistant at National Science Foundation as the assistant director, and was the person who commissioned that National Academy report, which I said, well, this is not very good and I can do better. Then the development of some of these theories have been done with various colleagues. Mike Willig at the University of Connecticut, Bill Zamer at the National Science Foundation, and David Mendel at UC Berkeley. And if you're interested, here's a variety. You can go to Google Scholar, put in my name, you'll come up with this stuff. This is the paper, this quarterly review paper from 2010, which sets the whole big framework for the theory of biology. So what I presented today and those other general theories, that's sort of the place to start. Notice though, that's paper is now almost 15 years old. So I'll warn you, the details of those theories have evolved over time, right? So these are not static entities, these theories. They can develop over time, either in not that the facts are wrong, but how they're expressed and so forth has changed. And so another thing you might want to look at is this book. It's meant as actually a general textbook, it's very short. It's only 7 chapters, one chapter for each of those general theories, plus a chapter on what is science. And it's available as a free download. If you just go to www.foundationsofbiology.com, you can download it as a PDF. Um, and it sort of goes into details at the level of an undergraduate textbook. And so there it is. That's one way of looking at the role of theory in biology, and now questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sam. I must say, during the entire talk, I was here just thinking how fortunate we are for having the opportunity to discuss things like the role of theories in biology. It's in moments like this, we remember how fortunate and privileged we are for having the opportunity to do research, right? So thank you very much. This was like a wealth of knowledge.
Would
Um,
you like me to stop sharing?
no, you can keep the
Okay.
questions slide there up. Thank you. And I will certainly download the book that you just shared with us. I must confess I did not know of this book, but now I do have a nice reading for the break, for the holiday break. And yeah, and I do have a few questions again coming, mostly from
Mhm.
a place of curiosity, if not ignorance in the field, I must say. Um, but before I jump into the questions, I also wanted to highlight that I really liked how you showed us that, studying the role of theory in biology can actually be used for us to assess research. I did not see that coming. I really liked the scheme we used to show that research programs can be bolder, can be riskier. And I must say that that slide was surprising to me. I did not see that coming. So thank you. Now, my first question to you is actually it's a two-part question I want to say because I'm very interested in emergent properties and stochasticity, which you touched upon during the talk. And I think usually those topics are difficult to grasp and they might be intriguing because when we talk about models, right, we're talking about having a power of prediction, right, if you will. I
Right.
guess,
Yeah.
if I may be risky here right now, I would
Mhm.
say a good model would have a predictive power, right?
Right.
Now, when thinking about adding, stochasticity or contingency to a model,
Mhm.
I'm assuming there are ways and ways to go about that. So are there guidelines? And again, I do understand this must be discipline specific, but are there guidelines or principles on how to add stochasticity to a given model? What are your thoughts
Okay.
on
Well,
that?
yeah. So I, I'll uh, I'll start my answer by saying I am not a mathematician. So I do theory work, and I actually even do models. All the models I do are computer simulations.
Mhm.
I can program, but I'm not a mathematician. So yeah, so in simulations, for example, there are kind of standard ways to represent well, in the models that I do on the evolution of plasticity, the stochasticity comes in a couple different forms. Let's say in mutation, for example, right? Mutations are random, so you have random changes. In terms of who mates with whom, those are that happens by random natural selection, right? So you have a certain fitness, but that's just a certain probability of survival, and then there's by random chance, you live or you die. So yes, there are. I mean, the rules are really. So, what is the natural phenomenon that you're um, trying to portray in your model? So, for example, mutation, we typically take it for quantitative traits as this Gaussian distribution around some mean value. Um, which we've got for lots of traits, that's a reasonable kind of distribution. But the distribution could be Poisson for some kinds of random processes and so forth. And those can be added into either mathematical models, Bayesian hierarchical models of various sorts, or computer simulations. So in this case, in all cases, right, when you're building a model, as you say, models form predictions or provide ways of understanding, right? So sometimes the purpose of a model is to build a mechanism to see, does that mechanism then match patterns in nature, and as a way of sort of exploring them, right? So uh, uh, well, if we think of Watson and Crick, right, when they built their physical wire model of DNA, that was a way of trying, they couldn't observe, right? They didn't have electron microscopes then, right, to observe molecules, right? That was a way of saying, well, if here's how it must look, even though we can't see it. And in a sense, that's what we do with evolutionary models, for example, right? We're not directly observing evolution, because it might take millions of years. And so anytime you're adding stochasticity to a model, for example, it's, well, what is the process that you think is going on? Does does what you add to that model then mirror that process?
Wonderful. Thank you, Sam. And still speaking of contingency and stochasticity, at one moment you mentioned that I guess one inherent property or perhaps a consequence of having complex systems is stochasticity, right? And I
Mhm.
was just wondering, have we found out a tipping point in which, oh, from this complexity on, we have more stochasticity? Like, is there perhaps a correlation between how complex the system is
Ah.
and how strong stochasticity is in that system?
That's a great question, which I've never thought of, and I'm not the person to answer that question. I think uh, there are math people
Mm,
who may know the answer to that. I don't, but
wonderful.
that is a good question. Is that or what kinds of stochasticity get added to systems at certain levels of complexity. So good question. Hopefully somebody can answer it.
I know. Yeah, I might ask ChatGPT later on as well to
Yeah.
see what the first clues. Um, Well, and I think, yeah, I'm here looking at my notes and I'm getting even lost because this is a very interesting, topic. But I was wondering, when you mentioned, you've shown us the different levels, like how the different levels of or life organization, right, relate to the general theories. And you rightly so, beautifully so, you mentioned that individual really is almost the focal point, if you will, of so many
Mhm.
of those general theories. And that brought me straight into into that, if you will, controversy, let's say, of what's the level of selection, right? And I say
Mhm.
controversy between huge quotation marks because we know where the data lie, but I was just wondering your take on it, whether, we have multiple levels of selection
Right.
and
So yes, so there are multiple levels of selection. Um, I mean, I was trained at the University of Chicago, uh, and partly under Mike Wade and group selection. So I learned that stuff actually as an undergraduate and a graduate student. Yes, there are multiple levels of selection. The question really is what's the relative importance of selection at various levels? And probably the since you have to have those three properties of variation, a relationship to fitness, and genetic heritability, they those all come together at the level of the individual to the greatest extent. And so that's why we think of, sort of selection on individuals and populations as maybe the most frequent kind of selection, but it can exist both above and below that in the hierarchy as long as those properties are found. And probably as you move away from the individual up or down, it gets less important, right? So how does selection of on individual molecules within within an individual happen? Well, it's mostly on how those molecules relate up to the individual's phenotype. And beyond individuals, then there's whole questions about actually the heritability question, right? So to what extent is the composition of a community heritable over time? Um,
Very nice.
and and that creates diffusion. So it can happen at multiple levels. And we have evidence that it does, but it diffuses out from that central level.
Wonderful. Yeah, very, very nice, like beautiful way to put it, because I think it is yet another example of what you've taught us today, right? Of this hierarchical structure, this nested system of theories and models. And so yeah, using as an example the level of selection discussion, if you will. Well, with all of that, I must say that one beauty of the Zoom era is that we can record talks like this and keep them as a material that people can revisit. I'm certainly very, very excited to share this talk in the new year and have students in my program and other programs, watch this, learn this, and I'll certainly be watching again and revisiting and also reading the book you've shared with us and the papers. So with that, Sam, I would like to thank.
And let me just say, I put my email address in the first slide. So any of you who are watching this talk, feel free to, if you have a question, just go ahead and email me, and happy to answer.
Thank you. I might do that, I must say. Well, so thank you very much, Sam. It was a pleasure to have you here. I certainly learned a lot. The talk will certainly bring the whole series, continue bringing the series a notch up, and yeah, and we'll stay in touch. Okay, I'll stop the recording right
Okay.
now.